So we're going to have a look at circle theorems. Now, our first circle theorem, you may recognize this situation here, where we have a shape and it's a bit like a delta. And if we move this around, we can see that the angle at the outside is always half the angle at the center, or the other way of looking at it is the angle at the center is twice as big as the angle at the circumference. Now, sometimes this is described using the word subtend. We don't need to use the word subtend ever in circle theorems, so we're just not going to bother looking at that word. But it's often described as this: the angle at the center of a circle is twice the angle at the circumference, which is quite the mouthful. However, we don't need to make it that mouthful. We can just use only the underlined words. That's what the mark scheme says. So we're just going to cut this down to the underlined words, which is center angles twice circumference angles. And that's what I have in my head when I see this situation: center angles twice circumference angles. Now, the really common mistake is with this version of center angles twice circumference angles, our first circle theorem. The common mistake is to think that these are the same size. They might be, they might not be. We can't assume that. So if we get back to these 110 and 55, notice that if we move this around, clearly the chord on the left is shorter than the chord on the right, or vice versa. Just because it looks like it's roughly in the middle, we can't assume they are the same size. We can assume that this radius and this radius are the same size. That's fine. Radius is always the same size as each other. So in this situation, center angles twice circumference angles, all fine. But what about over here? Well, that's still center angles twice circumference angles. It gets confused with another circle theorem that we'll pick up in the future. But it's still center angles, it's still circumference angles. How can we tell? Well, we can tell because the center is involved. There's an angle there, and there's a circumference angle as well. Center angle, circumference angle. The final situation that confuses people is if we go around here and we get this quadrilateral. Again, people confuse this with a different circle theorem, but it's really important to recognize that actually it's still center angles, circumference angles. So these are the three situations we need to spot as center angles twice circumference angles. Final trick is to not really think of it as center angles twice circumference angles. That's a long old thing to have in your head. I think of it as CATCA. CATCA, center angles twice circumference angles. And that's what I have in my head. That's what I'm thinking about when I'm spotting this. And then as a separate part of my revision, I revise that CATCA links to center angles twice circumference angles. That's our first circle theorem, and we'll be looking at the next 6. If you enjoyed this video, please like. If you have a question, leave a comment. And if you want to see more like it, please subscribe.